Generous introduction. Do appreciate it. Yes, father of 5 amazing girls. I have a boy dog. So people have asked me, what's it like living in a house? Well, it's really 6 girls because my wife. What's it like living in a house with 6 girls? I said, well, the toilet seat is always down. And I never get an opinion about anything. So, but that means I don't have to make any decision. Most of the time, I have no idea what's going on. But they frequently tell me what's going on, so that's very helpful. No, God's been very gracious to me. I love all the girls. They're a blessing to me in so many ways. It is my immense privilege to be with you this weekend. I really do appreciate Todd asking me and inviting me. We're excited to share this weekend with you in fellowship. As he said, spent 2 precious years fellowshipping with Todd and Bronwyn and the church at St. John's Park, and made friends there that we still keep in touch with and still have. And I know there's a lot of new faces, so looking forward to meeting all of you and hearing about your testimony and how God's worked in your life. I've always appreciated Todd, his advice and his counsel and his friendship. These days we don't catch up as much as we should, probably Super Bowl and sometimes in between if we can. But I'm so thankful for Todd and his friendship over the years. He's helped me as I've grown and been shaped in theology and ministry and lots of different things, and so I do appreciate that. I don't want to spend too much time talking about myself. I'm not that interesting, and we didn't come here to learn about myself for sure. But just to give you a bit of background, you may hear a slight accent. I've been trying to get rid of it for 25 years, but it stays, and it's stuck. So had the privilege. I was born at a relatively early age in 1983. In the sort of Seattle, Washington area. And my parents were, my mom was a committed Roman Catholic. My dad went to church because they had coffee and donuts afterwards. My mom certainly took her faith very seriously. But through a series of events, God took our family to overseas to a few different countries. Moved to South Korea when I was 4, moved to London when I was 6. And it was during that time when my family was overseas that my mom in particular began to ask questions about her faith and began to ask questions about what she had grown up believing. A good friend of hers had come to know Christ and left the Catholic Church and was in those days sending tracts and information and things via the mail. Because that was the only way to communicate back in those days. And I remember distinctly we had a trip when I was about 7 years old through Europe. We did a little family trip through Europe and found ourselves in Rome, as you do as good Catholics, doing our little pilgrimage there. And I guess you could say my mom had a little bit of a Martin Luther experience when visiting Rome. God opened her eyes in many ways to the idolatry, to the false teachings, to the worship of men. While we were in Rome, and she really began to have a crisis of faith. God in his sovereignty and his providence led her to a Pentecostal pastor church. It was the only one she could find, and asked them to share what in the world the gospel was, and she'd never heard the simple gospel message before that. And it was a couple of weeks later that she describes being home alone and God just opening her eyes and saved her miraculously. And I remember that she explained that to us, what happened to her in the best language she could. My dad thought she'd gone crazy and joined a cult, was about ready to take my brother and I and leave. Thankfully, his sister told him that Protestants weren't too bad. So just stick around and maybe she'll get over it. Well, she never did. The Lord took us back to the United States when I was about 9 years old. We started attending a independent Baptist church because that was what we were invited to. And it was there that I first heard the gospel in a very simple way and responded in childlike faith. And I do think God did a work in my heart. It was a very simple faith, obviously, as a child, but began to understand and pursue the things of the Bible. It was interesting, when I was about 13 years old, I was on a youth camp with our church, and it was a very typical independent Baptist youth camp, a lot of fun, a lot of excitement, a lot of hype. The preaching was very emotional, not a lot of theological depth, but certainly very decisional, I guess you could say, calling us to make decisions for Christ and devote our lives to Christ and things. And I don't know, I just felt a stirring in my heart that God wanted me to go into full-time ministry. And I had an old Schofield King James Bible at the time. And I remember writing in the front of my Bible on this date, wrote the date down. God called me to full-time ministry, and I don't even know why, but I put in Australia. And I didn't even know that a couple months later my family would be moving here. We moved here when I was 13, and I thought this was the worst place in the entire world. I didn't understand what anybody was saying. Everyone was driving on the wrong side of the road. What in the world is Vegemite? I don't know why I have to wear a uniform to school. The church was small that we were attending. It was totally different. And I can remember just at a time, 13 to about 15, just really wanting nothing to do with God anymore. And I took some liquid paper, and I went over that decision that I'd made and I'd written in my Bible, and I was like, there's no way in the world that I'm going to do that, especially here. And I liquid papered over that decision. And I always tell people, you may try to wipe God out of your life, but he never wipes you out of his. And it was a couple of years later, through a series of circumstances, series of people, that God began to soften my heart again. And it wasn't a distinct moment, but just began to gradually chip away at my arrogance and my pride. And through a series of just exposures to good preaching and challenges from God and other people who were influential in my life, he really broke my heart again. And I began to think about and pray about what God wanted me to do with my life. And I went back over that decision and rededicated my life to serving God in this country. When I was finished high school, I left to go to Bible college, moved up to Grafton, New South Wales for 3 years, to a small little independent college up there. It was a great 3 years of my life, loved it. Moved back to Sydney to what I thought was going to be a time of working with another pastor in serving in a little church plant that my parents were involved in. And then 2 years after that pastor stepped down and asked me to take up the church. I was 23 years old and engaged at the time, and full of zeal and starry-eyed, and was certain that I was going to have a mega church in 10 years. And there was as many people there when I left as when I started. And so God has a way of humbling us. Those 7 years were an amazing time. I would not ever recommend anybody do that. That's not a recommendation I would make, but that's just part of our story. God taught me a lot. God humbled me a lot. And it was in that 7-year period of being on my own that God brought me along people like Todd and other people that I'd met, that God began to really reshape my theology, my understanding of the Bible, of the Word of God. I discovered this dude called John MacArthur, as many of you probably have. You stumble across him and go, who is this guy? And he really ministered to me across the pond there. God brought me to an end of that ministry after about 7 years, and that's when we went into the wilderness at St. John's Park Baptist and spent 2 years there. And I remember it was actually at finishing up a family camp that we had attended, that I was driving home with my wife, and I said, you know what, I've got to get back into something. I don't know what it was. I don't know what it is. I don't know. I need to do something. And I started looking on, do we go overseas on some crazy mission trip? Do we do some? I needed to get back into something. I loved my job at the time, but I just knew it wasn't what God wanted me to do, and began to pray. and eventually got a call from Emmanuel Baptist Church, and they invited me to come be a part of their pastoral staff. And we've been there for 5 years, and loved it. Brother Andrew Cordes is our senior pastor, and he's had time at St. John's Park as well, so there's a lot of kind of background and connections there, and we get along phenomenally, and are really excited about the future. But as we all know, the past couple of years have been quite a challenge for churches and Christians, and how do we navigate this world? So that kind of leads me into the series as to why I chose this series. And it really came out of a couple of months ago, we preached through the first six chapters of Daniel in our church. We shared the series, but it really highlighted to me as I was preparing or preaching or just listening to the word, just how relevant this part of the Bible is for us as believers in Australia. And I think the last couple of years has really highlighted to me just how much we are in essentially, or at least very much heading into a time, I believe, of quote-unquote exile, if you would, as believers. We're not fully there yet. We can still, meet in Christian campsites and different things like that. But I think what stood out to me and what I'm hoping to communicate to us this weekend is just how similar the culture was in Babylon, and drawing out the similarities of the world that we find ourselves in as Christians. And how do we navigate life? How do we navigate the world? But how do we obey God and be faithful to God in this time where perhaps we feel like we're so out of place? And that's what Daniel and his three friends found. They had to figure out how to live faithfully to God in a culture that was diametrically opposed to their beliefs and their understandings of God and of the Bible. Where did they draw their lines? Where did they make stands? What does that have for us today? What kept them faithful in these times? And one thing that, and I'm not going to preach too much tonight, but one thing that stood out to me as well is that understanding why in the world they were there in the first place. And honestly, it had nothing to do with them. It wasn't their fault. The reason why Israel goes into exile in the first place is because of the sins of a wicked king some 80 years before Daniel and his three friends are even born. And they're there because of the sins and the wickedness and the disobedience of generations before, and now they're bearing the cost for the rejection of God in Israel. And even when King Josiah comes on the scene, which is where we believe Daniel and his three friends are born, sometime in the reign of King Josiah, who is a good and godly king, God doesn't turn his judgment away. He doesn't change his mind. He says, no, you are going to go into exile. And so Daniel and his three friends are going to a foreign land, living with a foreign people, never to see their homeland again because of the sins of a previous generation. It'd be very easy for them to become very bitter, to become give up, throw the hands up in the air and say, well, it wasn't our fault, so it's no big deal how we live, but they don't. And so I think there's a real lesson there for us as believers, as how we think of the world that we are living in now, where we see it going, and what are the principles that we can draw out that God has to teach us. And of course, to end with this is that remember that in the hero of every story in the Bible is God. God is the hero of every story. So don't expect me to come to you this weekend and preach on how to be a Daniel. Daniel's an example for us. His friends are an example for us, but the hero of this story is God. And so I hope that you'll go away with a greater faith in the God of Daniel, not in the person of Daniel. So it's a challenge to me. If anything, I'll go away just having enjoyed preparing the sermons for you this weekend. I hope it'll be a blessing and encouragement to you. And again, really looking forward to getting to know you all for this weekend. So hope that was okay. Thank you.
Great. No, I'm excited. Hope you guys are excited as well. Delayed, but you'll take it. Yeah, very excited. Be prayerful. Certainly pray for Ryan, but be prayerful for yourself and everybody else that we will learn all those principles. What was the old way of describing the book of Daniel? Dare to be a Daniel. Yeah, no, we want to, I guess it's not wrong to dare to be a Daniel, but we want, as you say, worship the God of Daniel. Before I let you go, and we are going to wrap up now, and I believe there's some supper down in the cafeteria for you, just got a few announcements, okay? If you haven't gotten your room allocation yet, you just need to see Annabelle or Angelique. This room is called the Valley View Room. I think there might have been a sign as you walked in. So all our sessions, session 1, 2, and 3, will be in this room. For each of those 3 sessions, we do have a kids program. Okay, and we'll say more about it in the morning. They will be with us for the first part and then take off when Ryan comes up. And that'll be just around the corner. You know the chess set that's out here? The room just right next to it. But I'll remind you of that in the morning. But just heads up, parents, for your kids. And that's for the primary age, I believe. That's right, Annabelle? So for primary year, Annabelle here? Or Angie, Johnny? It's primary age, right? So just say kindergarten up to year 6, yeah? Okay. And so we do have a kids program for them. We will need volunteers to help serve food. Now, we'll just take breakfast, lunch, and dinner one at a time. So for now, I'll just mention that tomorrow morning, breakfast is at 8 a.m., and we'll need volunteers to help serve the food. There's certainly be some kitchen staff there that's preparing it, but we need at least 4 folks to help out. I'll tell you the group we're going to take volunteers from, and I'm just reading Annabelle's note here. The Wombat room, which it says here, boys' cabin. So you guys are up first. So whoever's in the Wombat cabin, 4 of you, arm wrestle, do whatever you got to do to decide who's volunteering. And as Nathan said earlier, be there about 15 minutes. So about 7:45, make sure you're there in the kitchen ready to serve. Now, before breakfast in the morning and each morning, so Saturday morning, Sunday morning, there is a prayer meeting. It's at 7 a.m. and it'll be here in this room. So if you're keen to get up and just pray with the saints, let's start the day off, we would love to have you. I know that's early, and you're probably going to bed late, but it is camp. We only do this once a year, so suck it up, okay? So 7 a.m. here for prayer meeting, breakfast at 8 a.m. in the dining hall. I think everybody's recognized, and you'll find out right after this where it is if you haven't already, because that's where we'll have our supper. And I think Nathan also mentioned if you are special, see Elias, who's very special, for your diet, okay? And lastly, 9:30 a.m. is the first session. So, supper, bed, and, no curfew, but as Nathan said, with the neighbors, if you are outside, keep it down by 10:30, okay? Prayer meeting at 7 a.m., breakfast at 8 a.m., first session at 9:30. Before I dismiss you, any questions? No? Okay. We'll just wing it as we go, okay? All right, you are dismissed. Thank you.